And welcome back, everyone, to yet another episode of Going for Two, presented by our good friends at Home Field Apparel. I am your host, Matt Brown, the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter. And today, I'm flying solo. This has been a bit of a challenging week here, and I imagine the next week we'll be here too with trying to figure out times that work for Brian and I's schedules with a gajillion of interviews that we're doing, potential travel, other things. So we weren't able to get everybody in the same place, but that doesn't mean that you're stuck just with me. We have a guest for this episode. We'll have a guest for a couple other episodes here in the near future. One of the things that we have been curious about, even independent of all this conference realignment stuff and the administrative everything, is how organizations, athletic departments, specific teams, everybody else make decisions and how they can make better decisions. Part of that is advanced stats. Part of that are the interpersonal relationships that lead to effective athletic departments versus ones that are mostly run by outside boosters or other things. These are the kind of stories that really fundamentally depend who's actually that fundamentally demonstrate who's actually good or not, right? You can have all the money, you can recruit all the 4 and 5 stars you want, but if you're bad at communicating, if you're bad at building an effective organization, if you're bad at management, you become 2000s or 2010s Tennessee. You become Auburn. You become plenty of other places that just, Texas, that haven't been able to get the proverbial stuff together. As for this show, we're going to be talking with a gentleman named Marc Christian. He is with the Intellisport Analytics, a firm that tries to marry, if you will, numbers and words, right? Or just really study how organizations, particularly athletic organizations, collect data, figure out what data they want to actually use, and then work it all together. Marc is a professor. He works in the industry management school at Georgetown. He has been a coach before. He's been involved in this world on several levels. This is a podcast that is part of a paid sponsorship between both of us. I do occasionally accept these. So I want to be very upfront with my listeners, but also I only do these if these are the kind of people that I want to talk to anyway, right? I'm not going to accept some money to go do a special podcast episode on the Why Amateurism is Good Actually Institute or anything like that. This is somebody that we normally want to talk to anyway. So I'm happy to go bring Marc on and we can get into the weeds a little bit about how these conversations actually work. Wonderful. Marc, thank you. Thank you so much for taking some time here to chat with me. I know this has been a long time coming. I'm glad our schedules have finally aligned so we can chat.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's great to be on.
I want to ask a couple of dumb questions because I think your firm here, this Intellisport Analytics, and this idea of trying to bring data-driven insights to athletic department or athletic program management. I think a lot of our listeners, whether they're in the industry or not, would go, well, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like something that everybody needs to know. But then maybe drilling into the specifics might be a little bit more challenging. So let me ask you maybe a very kind of dumb question here first. We're talking about being data driven or data informed, and I'm some kind of athletic team, whether a pro team or a college team. What kind of data are we talking about? Because there's a gajillion different things that might go into that, and you can't be data informed if you don't have any idea what you should even be tracking, right?
Sure. Yeah, well, I first would probably make the distinction between what it means to be data-driven and data-informed, because I think those are two very different things. To me, data-driven is when you collect data and it helps you make the decision. In fact, it makes the decision for you. A set of facts is presented to you and leads you from point A to point Z, and it kind of reveals itself. Data-informed decision-making is you collect data, but there's an aspect, an unknown and human element, I would say, that is really important for consideration. And I think in athletics and sports broadly, there's this huge human element that we're thinking about, the people within organization, the athletes you're dealing with. And so even with the best data presented in front of you, you really have to be thinking about the human aspect of it. And what do we know? What does experience bring to the table? And using data and your informed experience, how can that lead to a decision? And so Intellisport Analytics is really more of the data informed route. We try to bring and help reveal the human element of organizations, whether it's at the team level or perhaps an athletic department level, and really help reveal some of those blind spots. But that's not going to completely dismiss the experience of athletic directors or coaches, because they're going to bring that lifelong experience they have to the table. And the data that we present is going to help uh, really kind of fill out that picture that's going to help them make a data informed decision rather than a data driven decision.
Now, this is a good point, and it's funny when I talk to other like industry publications, or if I've talked to other people about newsletters, like I go out of my way to make that distinction as well. Like I try to
Hmm.
collect data for going for two or for extra points or for my business, but part of the reason that like I push back on the idea of being data driven is because in the digital publishing world, I am convinced that a lot of the data is baloney. Not that like the concept of data is bad, but like the metrics that we use to track click through rates and ad data and downloads. I mean, every download for going for two is of course legitimate, but like for
Right.
in general, a lot of that's bots, or a lot of
Hmm.
it is it's difficult to really say like this data is so accurate. I would swear, that I'm comfortable making big business decisions based on that. I
Right.
would imagine in the athletics world, even for you can kind of tell how many tickets are sold, and Rasheed Wallace is right that the ball doesn't lie. The scoreboard is what it is, but I'm imagining trying to like get extremely accurate information about even more qualitative stuff can be a challenge in this world too, because just because you can put a number on it doesn't necessarily mean that number is 100% accurate, right?
That's right. Yeah, and that's where we bring a real rigorous research approach. So with the qualitative data, right, you can really collect data from an organization through two ways. One-on-one interviews and focus groups, and that's the approach we take. And we think that's really important because within an organization, right, there's going to be you have your leaders, and it's typically a hierarchical structure. So those who are higher in the organization typically have the most agency to move an organization in a certain direction. However, your people that are below those leaders, those are your operators, right? And those are the
Yeah.
people that are going to be able to deliver on the mission. And they come to the workplace with a certain set of expectations and outlook and beliefs. And if there's a misalignment between the leadership and your people, then there's going to be some sort of hiccup towards achieving your goals. And I say that with the belief that qualitative research can help bring out what people think in your organization. So if you're spending a lot of time, listening to your people, and if you do that in a thoughtful and rigorous way, you can start to identify what those themes and trends are, and you can do that through a rigorous research way, and start to say with confidence or a certain validity that this is where your people are, and maybe we need to work towards a certain direction to have an alignment.
Let's a lot of the work that your firm does seems to
Hmm.
focus on the concepts of alignment and culture, which
Hmm.
tend to be which are things that I think you hear every leader in this industry talk about as critically important. Every football coach,
Yeah,
when media day starts in a couple of weeks, they're going to talk about trying to build a player centered or player driven culture, and how and how with rosters being transient and assistant coaches being transient, culture is the only thing that's permanent. What we're trying to build here, right? And I think
sure.
fans understand, okay, intellectually, I understand that
Yeah.
culture is important, but you can look at 247 or on three, and you could get an idea for the quality of roster someone's building, because we have a star system, and it's very easy to kind of tell with the NFL draft or on-field production whether you have enough talent. In your
Hmm.
experience as a coach and as an analyst now, and as somebody who's is doing into this, are there obviously, like, not every successful culture is the same, but are
Right.
there measurable themes or consistencies through some of the places that you've examined, these interviews that you've done, of high functioning competitive cultures? What are things that you typically look for in these interviews, or that people can see if things are working?
Yeah. So, I think it's also important to first start with, like, what is the working definition of culture? And for me, that is
Yeah.
really what the shared beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of the leaders and perhaps employees or your athletes of an organization or team. And so, what does that truly mean? It basically is, what are the accepted behaviors within a team or an organization? And I think whatever that accepted behavior is, whatever the lowest denominator is, that is your culture. So whether
Mm,
you are, is it an organization or team that holds people accountable, or they're people that do what they want, or they're people that are not on the same page. And so, I think the high performing cultures are the ones that understand what their values are. They're often talked about, and when you deviate from what those values are, there's people within the team that hold people accountable. And it can't. What's very important is it can't be always the same people.
Yeah.
Everyone has to be on the same page, and you have to be able to know that in your moment of weakness, that the person next to you will be strong enough to hold you accountable to what everyone espouses to hope to achieve, right? And I think that's really important. Now, culture, I think, is can really seem intangible, right? And it feels like it's this ever moving target. So it's really important to map what the values are of people in an organization, and what are the steps that are going to be able to hold people to those values. So I think if a team or a coach, a leader, if they're exploring, if they're discussed, and they're continuously reiterated, then it's more likely than not that a good culture will come about.
And you have been an athlete yourself. You've
Mhm.
coached. You've been around athletes for a long time, even before you were in this particular professional setting. Can you maybe give me an example of what you thought was like, maybe before you founded this firm, like, hey, this was a culture that I was around either because it was high performing, or it was identity affirming, or it was efficient in many other ways that I've used as a template, or I've been thinking about as I now interview and talk to other people. Was there an example of a team that really kind of jumped out to you as like, this is the kind of culture that people should be emulating?
Well, I can only speak to my experience, Matt,
Sure.
and I go back to my time as an athlete. I swam at Kenyon College, and for those who don't know that, Kenyon, the swimming team, they won 33 straight NCAA Division 3 swimming titles. And I
Yeah.
got to be
Well, I don't
part
know. I
of.
don't know if I've told you this. I'm from Granville. I used to go
No
to
way.
yeah, I used to go to swim camps there all the time. I mean,
That's unbelievable.
Kenyon could kick some Division 1 team's ass, and
Yeah.
it's funny because for those who don't know, and this is with deep love in my heart too, Kenyon is the exact opposite of a jock school. I think in many many other ways, but this particular program is a just dynasty in Bumblefart, Ohio. Sorry,
hmm
yeah,
No, it's yeah. I think that's
yeah,
100% accurate. And so I had the great fortunate to swim under Jim Steen. And he had been there for over 20 years before I arrived on campus. And what I think was very clear to the athletes when they arrived was that there were certain expectations placed upon the athletes. However, the expectations were very much explained, and there was, I think, opportunities for grace when, inevitable failures occurred, right? And so it was that Coach Steen was very able to. He was always guiding the ship. He was tending his garden, right? He was making sure that from a day to day standpoint, everyone understood what the expectations were, and we were held accountable to those. But it was a way that everyone heard what they needed to heard. I always use the analogy with him, if we lined up all 50 athletes, right, 25 men, 25 women, he could walk down the line and really understand what everyone needed to hear individually, whether someone needed a little bit of tough love or they needed a shoulder to cry on. And I think that's really important for leaders to know, is that everyone in your organization experiences that team or that organization in a very different way. And so your approach and your response to someone has to be very personalized, has to be very specific. And so knowing who your people are is really, really important.
This is an important point because the baseline expectation, the minimum allowed behavior at a place
Yeah.
like Kenyon, like that is the same. But the message to communicate that message to each individual athlete may be very, very different.
hmm
And the process to get somebody to that point is very different. I would imagine, even just very practically speaking, though, that's a challenge for a coach, even just from a logistical standpoint. Because I mean, well, how big was Kenyon's staff? Like 3 people, and then one of them has to be like a GA or something. This is not Ohio State where you have
Right.
the population of El Salvador as your dobos that are kind of running everything here. You're this relatively modestly resourced NCAC school, and you
Yeah.
need to the charge, if I'm understanding this right, is you have to build a personal relationship with everybody, from your best backstroker to somebody who you're hoping develops into a contributor 3 years down the line. That's a big
Yeah,
interpersonal social commitment, right?
it is. And I would say, Matt, I think there's a misconception between, what a D3 school can do and what a Division 1 school based on the resources.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think it comes down to what a person prioritizes. Because, I had great experiences at Kenyon, but that was also replicated at Division 1 schools too. And I think what always was what was always present for the people who I most gravitated to, or I had the most impact from, were those who prioritized getting to know myself or my colleagues and really trying to understand, what makes us tick, and what are our aspirations, or what do we need as a coach. And maybe it wasn't something big, right? Every ask doesn't always have to cost a half a million dollars. Maybe it's just understanding that my line is open. If you need to talk to me, then it's available. And I think you know schools that perhaps more don't have the largest budgets, it doesn't have to be a funded initiative. It can be just understanding what are the good practices, of being a good person, leading with empathy, and knowing how to best impact your people. And if you're familiar with the organizational psychologist Adam Grant, he just came out with a recent podcast, and he does a lot of the stuff about how organizations operate. And he kind of shared recently that there was new evidence on the Great Resignation that shows a toxic culture is actually the biggest driver of turnover, more than burnout and more than low pay. And so, organizations really should be prioritizing their resources, or how they are structuring the organization towards, how can we help people reach their potential? How can we meet them where they are? What do they need? Um, and so the bottom denominator here was that culture toxicity exists when a culture prioritizes results without relationships. And I think that's really evident in sports, right?
Yeah.
Sports are driven towards winning. And if the ends justify the means, then you're going to lose a lot of good people in the process. And so how you do things is really important, not just what you do.
This is a great point, and this idea here of not every one of these asks needs to be well funded. Yeah, this is well meant, and I'm sure both
Hmm.
of us and anybody that's in this industry that's been around anyone in the Division 2 or Division 3 or the high school world knows you don't need a ton of money to be a good interpersonal communicator, to show empathy, and to build a relationship. That
That's
happens
right.
in Pop Warner, where nobody's getting paid, and it
Exactly.
doesn't happen sometimes with the Jacksonville Jaguars, where everybody's getting paid quite a bit of money, right? And
Yep.
certainly we can see this with these high achieving cultures. Let's talk a little bit about toxicity, because I would imagine
Hmm.
that any AD or coach that's listening to this point nodding along, like, yes, I would also like to build Kenyan swimming. If I can't
Hmm.
build Kenyan swimming, Denison swimming sounds pretty good, or some other like very high achieving, program here that doesn't have a $45 million operating budget. But of course, building this and wanting to build this are two very different things. And I would imagine that, no leader or no AD is going to think, well, if my coach is in there throwing chairs at people and calling them ethnic slurs and diminishing them, well, clearly that's toxic, and that's easy to see. That's malignant. We
Right.
we can remove that. In your professional experience and in your lived experience, are there signs that a culture may be toxic, or at the very least not functioning the way it needs to, that are not exorbitantly obvious, or that sometimes like well-meaning leaders or coaches might um, routinely miss, that
Yeah.
prevents them from building what you're trying to talk about here?
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part, right? Trying to understand, these organizations that perhaps are middling, and they aren't doing well, and the reasons are not obvious, right? There's not a scandal that has come about. Um, and so I think we have to really understand is look at some of the finer points. Are athletes more frequently leaving a program? Are they coming to your administrators asking for help? Our assistant coaches turning over underneath a head coach. So some of these smaller metrics that are kind of pointing to that there's perhaps some sort of challenge. In the case of my sport, where I coach swimming, it could be that some athletes maybe were underperforming, that they came in as a highly touted athlete, yet they weren't improving, or they stayed the same, and you have to start asking your questions. Why is it? You may have the best coach that is really good at X's and O's, but the culture is stagnant because they're not getting the and emotional growth that they need to be taking those steps to be high level athletes. Um, I, in my experience, with Intellisport, what we're doing is that we're trying to approach this from two lenses. From a quantitative standpoint, really deploying surveys that are built in conjunction with the stakeholder, whether it's the coach or the administrator, and that we kind of bring our set of standards, but it's customized to ask really relevant questions of perhaps what's going on. And then we're pairing that with interviews to really understand what the lived experiences are of athletes within an organization. And I think it's really important for a third party to come in and help with that, because the coaches and leaders, they're in the trenches, and they have somewhat of a biased outlook in terms of what they think is going on.
Yeah.
And despite their best intentions, that could be off. And so when we come in and help an organization ask these questions and try to really pull out, and elevate the voices of the athletes and coaches, we can really kind of get a clear picture of what's going on. We'll start seeing trends and ideas.
On this front, you kind of got me thinking a little bit here, and being able to have this survey driven data and ask these kind of conversations feels very important. But going back to this to resources, not every ask towards building a better culture needs to be resourced, but often data collection and data analytics needs to be. This is a major question in lots of sports when I talk to coaches and even to administrators about coaches, or how do I most effectively get data I need to make better coaching decisions? It costs a lot of money to do play tracking. It might cost money to have cameras so I can better understand heat maps or what my athletes are doing on the court. And then it costs money to be able to distill that in three
Right.
sentences so my 18-year-old that I see for 8 hours a week can actually understand that. In your experience as an athlete, coach, professional, are there I guess case studies or best practices or things that you've seen from an ability to gather data from an institution that might not have unlimited resources? Like if everybody could have Synergy Sports and employ you and do 8 other things, I'm sure that would be wonderful. But not everybody can run their own little Sloan conference, right?
That's right. Well, I think, right, the data collection and data analytics, it's this massive field, right? And when you try to understand what you need, it can feel somewhat overwhelming, right? So I think number one, you have to determine what are your priorities. I think each program is in a different stage in their evolution. So, if a coach was just hired and they're taking over a program, they have much different priorities than coaches that has been there 10 years. So understanding your priorities and what data you need to know, and really kind of being very selective, can, I think, be can help you be efficient in terms of your time, right? Because data analysis takes a lot of time, but also you can be a little bit more economical with where you're putting your resources. So understanding your priorities, I think, is really important. And the second, I think it's when you understand your priorities, the systems you put in place are going to help you establish benchmarks. And a data point in one point in time doesn't tell you anything. Data over time will start telling you a story. So if you can determine your priorities and establish benchmarks, you'll start seeing trends in terms of what you're trying to understand. And I think if you're in that focused, and if you do that in a focused way, you can start to understand your people a little bit better. And then it should be hopefully a little bit of predictive, and maybe you can understand, where your team is moving, or how your organization is moving. And at that point, maybe you can pivot to doing something else. So those are kind of the way I think about it, and some of the stuff I've done in terms of as a coach and as a data scientist.
When you have come in there to assist other sports organizations to maybe conduct some of these surveys or walk through an organization's culture with somebody, have you ever experienced real reticence or buy-in from coaches, because I have found, and unfortunately, I'm not as plugged into the swim coach world as I am maybe for football, basketball, and baseball, but there is a say a wide, there are some coaches that are eager to embrace a third party coming in and talking about their culture, or eager to embrace different kinds of data. And there are some that have decided that how they did things in 1989 is how they should continue to do things. And competition is not won on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Have you faced reticence from anybody, and how have you tried to overcome the fact that maybe it's actually good to get numbers sometimes?
Well, yeah. So I think, the programs I've worked with, right, this is something that they've wanted, and they've wanted
Yeah.
to be thoughtful about what they're doing. And so I think that's, step one is getting buy-in and helping people to step back and try to understand, where what they believe they are doing, and whether they're open to understanding it, unpacking it. I think that's really important. Um, you know, our own biasy really drives how we think and how we make decisions. My hope is when you bring a research approach to it, is that you can somewhat eliminate some of that bias and really kind of pull out and unpack, what's going on within an organization. So it does require people to buy in, and really try to understand, what's going on. There's a program I'm working with right now, and they do have a really strong tradition of winning, and they want to understand what the role of winning is, right? So this is a coach who maybe doesn't need to do this because they've been successful. However, they to try to continue to evolve and be proactive. They're trying to understand, how does winning impact what we do? Does it cause us to rest on our laurels, or does it motivate us to be better than what we were? And so, we're asking questions around winning, but then we're doing it at another layer. We're trying to understand what I'm calling horizontal and vertical relationships. So the horizontal is, athlete to athlete. How would they describe their relationships? And then the vertical is from the athlete to the coach. And so breaking it down from those two different dimensions is going to give really good insight into what's going on. Is the relationship between the athletes, is it strong, or are there problems that they need to work through? And our coaches giving athletes what they need, and our athletes giving coaches what they need. So thinking about it from those two different levels is going to really kind of give us a full picture of what's going on.
No, this is a good point. And I'm imagining a world where perhaps an athlete may be more comfortable talking through things, maybe with you even, than they would
Hmm.
proactively going out to another athlete if there are problems. And then now you have a realization that you actually have to work through some of those things to build that better culture.
Right.
Mark, I think my last question here, and forgive me if this is maybe a little bit too broad,
Okay.
but given that you've been in mentioned this world here, deep in this world here for several years now on multiple different levels, have there been any misconceptions that you've had about successful cultures, or about how cultures change and evolve, that now that where you changed your mind, something that maybe you thought as a coach or as an athlete, and now as you've had a chance to talk with organizations outside of your sport or have a wider data set, you think, well, actually, no, now I think I really believe X, Y, or Z. Is there anything? Has
Yeah.
there been a place where you've changed your thinking?
That's a great question, Matt. Well, I think from two different things. One is that, winning can hide a lot of flaws, and
Yeah.
and that's not necessarily a good thing, right? And so even with your winning programs that are doing really well, that doesn't preclude you from asking the tough questions about what is going on and what can improve, right? I think, uh, you know, it would be an easy Google query to look into, any sort of successful program. They still have their challenges too. So I think it's really important for even the best to go through some sort of practice of self-examination of what they're doing, what can they do better, and are they doing it the right way. Um,
Yeah.
and then secondly, I would say that, as a coach, especially, and within higher education, you know, we're so focused on high performance and, producing, these uh, experiences in sport that is based on winning and just having these outsized, outlandish, winning experiences, right? And there's so much more that goes into it. The day-to-day training, the expectations in the classroom, the social element, and so the sports, I guess, complex that we're part of, right? It's all focused on the outcome, and there's so much more that goes into it, the day to day, and so stepping back and trying to understand what that is, appreciating it, and walking that with the athletes is so important. And you can't treat your athletes as commodities. You have to treat them as people, and make sure that you're giving them what they need, and that you're being very clear and supporting them the whole way.
That's a great point. And it's funny, like as you were talking about this idea of, winning can mask a lot of negative culture
Hmm.
aspects. And there's problems that might come if you become so bottom line driven. My mind immediately thinks to the business world, right? I read Liar's Poker too. Like I'm familiar with it, what happened
Yeah.
at Solomon Brothers. And like that seems like a place where like your internal culture, super rotten, very bottom line driven, very successful for a long time until they weren't, right? And I think
That's right.
anybody that's taken 2 undergraduate business classes or has a Bloomberg subscription can think of other organizations where the internal culture was not where it needed to be, but was successful for a long time. I
Mhm.
kind of piggybacking off that. Do you believe that the cultures of a successful sports program or athletic department or sports organization, if that is so subject matter specific that there aren't a whole lot of great takeaways that can be learned from other organizations, or if we're talking about successful culture, are there meaningful lessons that could be taken from the business or
Yeah.
nonprofit or you
Yeah.
know cultures that have nothing to do with sports?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have to look outside of your realm to understand best practices. That's where I think, some of the best coaches are adopting, the best practices of the business world. So I do think it's really important. And you triggered my memory a little bit. We did some work with an NGB, a national governing body, recently, and they want to understand the relationship of trust and satisfaction, and the coaches that were queried, they rated this organization as very competent in how they ran their enterprise. However, they were rated lower on the trust and accountability. So even though they did a really great job running their events, there was some sort of element, there was a gap between accountability and trusting them. So um,
That doesn't
this
sound
kind
like any national governing body I'm aware of in this world.
of right. So
Allegedly
you
very
you
good at running events, stakeholders, low level of trust. Not saying that this is who you worked with,
yeah.
but boy, that sure sounds
Yeah,
familiar to my listeners.
yeah, so right, it's you can be really great. You can produce, Olympians, you can have really great sport experiences, but there's still some sort of gap. And so working through that is really important. And you have to look elsewhere to try and understand what are these best practices that you can bring into your organization and implement to help make sure you're delivering on your mission.
Wonderful, Mark. This has been really helpful. I think you have given me some things to think about here, in terms of how to evaluate a successful culture, what that means for your organization, how people actually go about getting it, and how they measure it. It's I mean, I'm literally even thinking about like our company for
Hmm.
about some of these things. To say nothing of the athletic departments that we work with. This has been really helpful. Thank you so much for taking some time with
Great.
us today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Real quick, before we wrap up here, I would be remiss if I did not shout out our good friends at Home Field Apparel that make all of everything here work. Home Field, of course, makes the most comfortable, the most unique, the most interesting, officially licensed collegiate apparel, from these extremely comfortable t-shirts to sweatpants to tank tops and all manner of other things. I generally wear Home Field stuff when I'm at home. If I'm not doing a Collegiate Sports Connect or going into a press box or anything, I'm wearing a vintage BYU baseball t-shirt right now. It's funny because this is a cougar that very much looks like he should be having a cigarette hanging at the corner of his mouth, which feels very un-BYU-ish, which makes it a funny t-shirt. Um, the last several weeks, the interview was pre-recorded, but the last several weeks, Homefield's been dropping some bangers with collections from Oklahoma, with Nebraska, with Kansas State, and they're dropping Northwestern this week, which I'm told is a good school. Which you would know about that if you'd never talked to anybody from Northwestern. But I have seen some of these designs. I have some vintage Northwestern stuff already. I will definitely be spending money on this. I don't think they got the license from Medill, so I don't have to spend $35 and explain to my wife that it's very important that I own this shirt for a Twitter bit. But there's legitimately good Northwestern things that you should get, along with all these other schools. If you get them, use promo code Extra Points to save 15% off that order, and drop me an email at matt@extrapointsmb.com if you would like to get some of your stuff on Homefield as well. I'm happy to make the introduction. I'll just also quickly say here, as we head into August, we go back to a different regular publishing schedule. We're going to ramp up some of our conference previews, which are very different from your typical preview, because I'm not going to get as into the X's and O's weeds, and I'm going to try to get much more higher level as we get into the space. That we are also happy to work with you, whether that is for a longer sponsored podcast, which we might do once a month, maybe a little bit later, or other interview spots here. We are happy to help promote some of your products. That is at sales@extrapointsmb.com. I thought this was an enlightening interview. These are some of the things that are harder to, I think, really explain, but they really do fundamentally play a huge role in the success of teams, schools, athletic departments, your church basketball team. And the quest to try and not just figure out how to implement or use data, but even what data to get, is something that we've been fascinated with here across D1 Ticker for a while. While I'm not on the phone doing EA stuff or conference realignment stuff or transformation committee stuff, one of the other stories I have been working on, and we might not see the fruit of this labor until September or October, but we're trying to understand more of the advanced stats analytical world, particularly in non-football sports. And we're talking to other experts in that field, whether those are brands or statisticians or some coaches, and we'll be happy to share some of that as well, because all of this stuff is super interesting to me. Hope it's interesting to you too. Thanks so much for sticking with us here. We've got some more guests and other shows coming up as we wrap up this month, while Brian and I are kind of zip-zagging around the state and across the country. You can email me at matt@extrapointsnb.com. Say nice things about our show on social media or wherever you're getting your podcasts. That makes it easier to justify doing this to our bosses. And subscribe to Extra Points and D1 Ticker if you have not already. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. Catch up with y'all next week.